Cześć, witam wszystkich bardzo serdecznie. Pewnie dziwicie się, że widzicie tutaj mnie, a nie Tambonietu, ale dzisiaj TuGadka, którą wyjątkowo poprowadzę ja, bo mamy też wyjątkowego gościa, a jest to Craig Campbell i teraz już przerzucam się na angielski, bo nasz gość tym właśnie językiem się posługuje. Hi Craig.
Hi.
Hi. It's lovely to have you here, and I'm really happy that you agreed to have this interview. So we are here to talk about one of your really cool games, and I had this privilege to get into it and to run a one shot for a group of people. But first, let me introduce you in a few words, Craig Campbell, who is the lead designer of Nerdburger Games, and Nerdburger Games were founded in 2015. So I've been thinking, what's the best option to introduce you properly? And I just made a little research, and I stole a description from your page, which is, who is Craig? Craig is an architect by day and RPG designer by night, and a streamer, podcaster on the weekends. So you are one busy man.
I am.
Moreover, what you say about yourself is that you are a part-time psychopomp and you are often friendly. When I look at you, I would say you are more than often friendly, but what does it mean to you that you're often friendly? To what people?
I guess I don't try to fool anybody into the idea that I'm always happy and friendly and wonderful, because we are all human beings and we all have bad days. But I am often friendly. I try to be friendly and happy and as much as I possibly can.
My God, this is one of the smartest answers I could ever hear for that type of question. And you also said that you are getting older and crankier. So what is the most cranky thing you've lately done?
Oh boy. Well, I'm not going to name any names, and it's not as though he would ever listen to this, but there was a particular coworker today that I was just very, very frustrated with, because I work as an architect. And I do a lot of drafting, so I'm working in AutoCAD as a software, and I've been working with this particular coworker for 15 years, and I had to teach him how to do something that I have taught him how to do probably 7 or 8 times over the course of those 15 years. And it just come on, man, just write it down, make some notes or something. I don't want to have to teach you to do this again. And I didn't say anything to him. I was happy. I was friendly. But boy, that gets to me.
All right.
I don't mind having to revisit, but when I have to teach somebody something that they should know how to do and have to do it multiple times, it gets frustrating.
Right. So that was actually my next question, because being an architect, how does it, and if at all, it helps you? Because what came to my mind was that actually you are an architect not only by day, but in RPG sense, you are also an architect, because you create the whole worlds and design the whole worlds. So how does being an architect help you in being an RPG games designer?
That's something I've thought about quite a lot, and I think to answer that, I need to be clear with people what an architect does, because not everybody necessarily understands really everything an architect does. They assume they design buildings, right? That's the core of it. But there's a great deal more to it. The architect is very much a project manager. Oftentimes, they are designing the look and the aesthetics of the building and the functionality of it, but they're also coordinating all of the consultants. So they have to know a little bit about mechanical and electrical and plumbing and structural and all these sorts of things. And they have to work with these people, these engineers in these other fields, and they have to work with the owner or the client. And there's a lot of managing all of these pieces, because putting a building together is a very complex process, and it requires a great many different people with different skill sets. And publishing a role-playing game book, or publishing any game, or really publishing a book, even just a prose book, has a lot of that to it as well. There are multiple people that are involved in it. They all have to be kind of working together on the same page. They're trying to get the same result. They're feeding each other with their particular skill sets. And I do the bulk of the game design for Nerdburger Games, but I'm also the developer, and I sometimes edit things, and I'm the publisher, and so I have to also be the art director, although I'm not the artist. I hire artists and sometimes other designers and map makers and so forth. So there's a lot of that sort of like managing all these people to get this product, to get this game put together. But then even within the realm of game design, and the realm of the designing, the building part of architecture, I always think of it as there's an art and there's a craft. The art is the aesthetic, what it's going to look like, what it's going to feel like, the emotion that it's going to bring out in you. And for a building, it's the same way. Like, how does the building feel? Is it comfortable to be in? Is it awe-inspiring? Is it purely functional? Does it do its job? And the game design is the same thing. Like, you've got all these aspects of the aesthetic, but then at the same time, there's a craft. There's a way you put a game together. And there's a lot of different ways to do it, but there are components that need to be fit together like a puzzle. And in architectural design, there are rooms and functions that need to work together to make the building actually do what it's supposed to do. If it's a restaurant, it needs to do all the things a restaurant does. If it's an office building, it needs to do all the things an office building is needed for. And so there's a craft and an art to both of them.
And you can really see that in your games too, because we are here to talk about good, strong hands, but we will get to that. But I couldn't help myself but also ask you about a few games that are also very important, I think, because you've created many games that were honored and that were granted and that got prizes. And for me, it's very important to mention it because, you're just like, you're playing RPGs for about 30 years, right? But you designed them for about 15. So it's about half of that time. So it took quite a long time for you to get into the design. But in 2001, was it, when you made your first paid freelance? And it was Winter Tears, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was like for convent. Can you tell me, have you got a special sentiment for this piece, for Winter Tears?
I do, and I've told this story other times. I like telling this story. Winter Tears was an adventure that I wrote for Dungeons and Dragons, for 3rd edition. Years and years ago, at the beginning of 3rd edition, they started what was called Living Greyhawk, where they took the D&D world of Greyhawk and they split it up into pieces, and they spread those pieces out over different states in the United States, as well as different countries and regions around the world. And people wrote adventures, and players could play in these different adventures in these different parts of the Greyhawk world. And I happened to be, at the time, living in Wisconsin, which and Wisconsin has a lot of gamers, of role-playing gamers. It's where Dungeons and Dragons was invented. So there's gamers everywhere. And we were the High Folk region. And that first year, there would be 8 adventures every year written by the organizers for that region. But the first year they wanted to kick off and do it big, so they had 12. And I got to write the 12th adventure, the last adventure for that first year, because I knew one of the guys who had become one of the organizers, and he said, "Hey, Craig, you write some fun stories, and I had DM'd him in games. Do you think you could write it all down as an adventure?" And I said, "Sure." And so I came up with this idea for the Winter Tears, which is sort of a damsel in distress story, but it gets flipped on its ear because the person who was going to go rescue the damsel ends up needing rescuing, and that's what the characters end up having to do. So in order for this other character to rescue, the NPC who's trapped, the characters have to go get him out. And it was a challenge writing it. I enjoyed the challenge. I enjoyed writing it. I've looked back on it over the years, and there's a lovely little story there, I think, and it's there's good stuff. Like, I think you could play that story and have fun with it, but it's not well written. Like, it's just like, I would write it so differently. I would describe things so differently. Like, I've progressed as a game designer and a writer that I would have done it very, very differently. It's rough, but I love it.
And I think that's what really matters. I mean, many people would say that I would have done so much things differently if I had a chance to just turn back time and do it again. And then we've got another game, Murders and Acquisitions. We've got, corporate, we've got espionage, we've got subterfuge, theft, intrigue, and this game was actually the winner of Bamsi Award in 2018. And it also was nominated for Best Rules, and it wasn't the only game nominated for Best Rules, because Good Strong Hands were too. And in 2019, it won India Groundbreaker Awards. So, we've got Roaring Twenties, which is personally one of my favorite places in the history. And we've got gangsters, we've got superpowers. So was that actually the first game that made you feel that this is something that you want to do on daily or, eveningly basis? Or was it before?
You're actually talking about two different games, and that's okay. Murders and Acquisitions was the first game that I did, and I did that kind of to see if I could do it.
Capers was the second one, of course.
Yep. And Capers came right after that, and that one got a Bamsi Award, and it got nominated for some Indie Groundbreaker Awards for art and for rules. I'd have to take a look at the list again. Murders and Acquisitions was like, what happens if people who work at an office just get sick and tired of each other, and they want to just get rid of each other and work climb up the corporate ladder by whatever means they can, and it's very tongue-in-cheek and kind of silly, and that did well enough that I was able to publish it when I kickstarted it. I covered my costs, so I thought, well, why not do some more? And then Capers is the one that kind of came along after that. And that was a challenge to do a game that used playing cards instead of dice. The game is entirely played with decks of playing cards. And the supers, it's a supers game set during the Roaring 20s, during the 1920s. Specifically set in the United States. In particular, there's descriptions of kind of important cities that had a lot of interesting things going on during that period. And that one has become sort of the flagship game. There have been multiple supplements. I did a Capers Cyberpunk game here a year ago that kind of tells the end of the story. Like, Capers starts in the 1920s, Capers Cyberpunk ends in the 2020s. So all the different books together kind of tell this story of how these superpowered criminals have kind of affected the world, because every one of the games, every variation is essentially cops and robbers, but with superpowers. And they've all been. Capers has been very good to me. It's been a game that I've gotten a great deal of recognition for, and it's been it continues to sell well, even several years after it first came out.
I'm not surprised, I must say, but let me also ask you, because as I mentioned before, a couple of those games were nominated for Best Rules. So what does it take to make a good game rules that are so highly appreciated? What is your key to make those rules really clear and good and well to play?
I think and I'm thinking not just of my games that have been nominated for that type of award, but also for other games that have been nominated for their rules. And I think there's usually two ways that a rule set can get recognized as being noteworthy and perhaps worth being nominated for an award. Is one, if it's a rule set that is widely applicable and can be used easily for a wide variety of game types. There are a lot of systems that I don't know if universal is the best word for them, but they are broadly usable. You can use this rule set with just a little bit of adjustment to play a fantasy game or a science fiction game or a horror game. And when a system can do all of those things really well with maybe just some minor adjustments, that's really special. On the other end of that is kind of where I function, which is rule sets that do a very specific thing and they do a very specific type of game. And when every single little part of the rule set feeds that particular theme and that idea and that gameplay experience, that's one of those where people will kind of take notice and say, wow, this is a really tight rule system that really does what it sets out to do. There's nothing wasted. And so I am forever pursuing creating that type of a rule set. I've been a little bit successful on a few occasions, but I'm still always kind of, I want the rule set to reflect the game very specifically.
Sure. Okay, next thing is that when I checked on Nerdburger Games Facebook profile, the first quote that I could see was, "I make RPGs. They are super fun. People have told me so, and people wouldn't lie, right? So would they? Is it still fun?"
It is. I enjoy doing it. If I didn't enjoy it, if it wasn't mostly fun, I'll say it that way. If it wasn't mostly fun, I wouldn't do it. There are certainly times where it's not fun. There are times where you're just trying to get something done. You're trying to figure out a problem, something in the rules, or there's just something that's missing from the setting that doesn't, like there's just something that's not working quite right. And that can be very frustrating. My solution to that sort of thing is usually I have multiple projects that I'm working on at a time, so I can set the problem aside and go work on something else for a while, and then come back to it maybe with fresh eyes and maybe hit on the idea, or I bounce ideas off of other people and people suggest things. So it is. I definitely do have a great deal of fun with it, but there's also this was something I saw on the internet, I don't know, several months ago, and I think it fits me as well. There comes a point in my game design work where I'm getting very close to the end, and I don't so much want to design the game as I want to have designed the game. I want it to be done and have it be like, oh, and there we are. Now it's done. It's great. Everything's put together. But It's those last few steps that can be really rough. Sometimes it's trying to get a rule thing kind of worked out. Sometimes it's just waiting for art to come in, for editing or layout to be finished. Sometimes it's just it happens at the tail end after, like, I could have a Kickstarter and I fund and everything's fine, and now I have to just wait for the thing to be printed. And you get anxious, and it's the fun factor falls away a little bit. But then you also know that there's going to come a point where you're going to get to that end, and it's going to be really exciting and really fulfilling. And so the fun the fun will always come back.
So would you say this is your favorite part, when you can finally see the results, when you can finally see that everything is illustrated, designed, described, and you are actually holding a product or a virtual product in your hand. Is this the best moment, or the best moment would be when the idea pops to your head and you start working? Which is better?
That's difficult to answer. Because they're better. They're both really good in different ways. Having the final product be finished has this sense of accomplishment, that you've done this thing, that all that work, all that time spent, all the headaches, all the problems, all the panic, is now done. And now there's this thing that didn't exist before, and now it exists, and that's really exciting, and fulfilling. But the idea, when an idea starts to, usually for me with an idea, it's a whole bunch of, it's an idea, and then I start to explore the idea, and it's a lot of little bits and pieces where I'm slowly kind of figuring out everything. And there comes a point where it all sort of clicks, and I think, oh, there's something here. And some ideas never get to that point, and those ideas go into a folder on my computer, and sometimes I go back to them, and a lot of times I don't.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a point where it clicks, and you think, oh, there's something here. This could be a game. And at the same time, there are different points in the rest of the process between those two beginning and end points that are really exciting and that are among my favorite moments as well. I was excited the first time this happened, and I get excited every time it does, is when I see the first artwork. Because for me, everything is words on paper, right? Everything is zeros and ones on a screen. And I think I know what the world looks like. I kind of have an imagining in my head of what this is going to look like. But an artist is going to take what I provide them and imagine it, and probably do some things differently than I would have expected. And I'm always those are they're one of the big win moments when you're doing this, is like when you see the first artwork, or the first time you see the cover, being even the first sketch of the cover, and then when you see the final version of the cover. And there's a lot of great little moments in there. There's when you finally feel satisfied that playtesting is done. Like, I've put this game through playtesting, it works, I think this is as good as I'm going to get it. There's a sense of relief and satisfaction that goes with that. There's a lot of little moments I really enjoy.
Yeah, you mentioned about seeing the first illustration, and I must say that Good Strong Hands is beautifully illustrated. And when I looked at the first page, something that really warmed my heart was the fact that when you read the names of the designers, of the illustrators, and many people who were co-working on this project, straight away you can see the pronouns, which is so important and so personal, and I really appreciated it. And the other thing is, could you say a few words, because not everybody is familiar with who is the sensitivity consultator, and there is a person who was responsible for that, and it's also very important. Can you say a few words? Who was the person? I mean, not maybe by names. If somebody wants to, they will check. But what was the function? What is a sensitivity consultation?
For this now, a sensitivity consultant can be a lot of things. They can focus on a lot of different things. If you're making a game that deals with Native American tribes, indigenous people, it's a good idea to have somebody, because nobody, you can't see me, but I'm a straight white dude. I know only what my history books teach me and what I've managed to teach myself and learn from other people. And so if I were to make a game that really focuses heavily on indigenous peoples, I would want an indigenous, a descendant of an indigenous person or an indigenous person to help with that in some way, whether they are going to do some writing, whether they're going to consult. For this game, Because it was a fantasy game, one of the things that I wanted to do was break away from the some of the standard tropes that you see in fantasy games. The things that you see, like D&D and Pathfinder and all these other fantasy games, often have a lot of the same kind of stuff running through them because it's what people expect to see in the game. If you read through Good Strong Hands, you will see there are no elves, no dwarves, no gnomes, no halflings, no drow elves, no goblins, no orcs. And that was done on purpose, partly to allow me to focus on different types of folk that are a little more fairy tale oriented, and but also to set aside some of the baggage that comes with some of those other those fantasy races that kind of grew out of D&D and Tolkien and so forth. And there's a lot of baggage that's built into that. Tolkien described certain races in certain ways because they were fantasy race stereotypes of types of human beings. And so it was, whether anybody writes about them now, if you write about drow elves, you're not necessarily, thinking of the fact that, well, they're dark skinned and therefore they're evil. And, does that mean they're like black people? No, black people aren't all evil. Drow elves are better presented when not presented as all evil. But I wanted to just kind of get away from all of those things that has that baggage attached to it. So I ended up hiring a consultant who is a person of color and we sat down and we talked through all the different things that I was planning to do with the game, about the types of folk that I was going to include, that I wasn't going to include, why I wasn't going to, what the artwork was going to look like, how I was going to make sure that certain things came through. Like if you look in the game, like oftentimes pixies are represented in illustrations and in folklore as being white people. But why can't there be darker skinned pixies? So there's a dark skinned pixie represented, shown in the game book. And we talked a little bit about all of these types of things. Like you don't have to fall back to the folklore version. The folklore usually comes out of a representation of some aspect of humanity. And that humanity is wondrous and varied, and there's all sorts of different types of people. So why wouldn't your folklore or the folk that you're using in the game reflect that? I go so far as to not use the word race in the game at all. It's folk. Each of the types of playable groups of similar characters are called folk. Because I just wanted to kind of set all that aside. And Stephen who helped me with this, we just talked through a whole bunch of stuff, and he gave me perspectives and thoughts that I had not really given thought to. And we had some really good conversations, and I hope that it made the game better and a little more representative of the variety of humanity, and doesn't hit on so many of these tropes that have kind of troublesome pasts.
Absolutely, and it shows with how much care and thoughtfulness you think about that game and what details were talked through and thought about. This is amazing. And also, it's funny that you mentioned dark skinned pixies, because with what I first looked at was the picture of a pixie, and when I saw it, I said, what a cool picture. I mean, all of those, no matter what you have on the description, before you read the whole description, you have some idea in your head of how does this pixie or this little brownie look like. And those illustrations were so up to the point. So can you remember actually when the idea of writing the setting of Good Strong Hands first came to your mind? Can you remember the situation?
Yeah. I can remember the exact moment. I was watching the movie, The Never Ending Story. And if you read Good Strong Hands, you'll see it is very much inspired by the Never-Ending Story. It is about a world that is being attacked by this horrible, faceless, menacing entity. In Never-Ending Story, it's called the Nothing. In my game, it's called the Void. And I found myself thinking, well, here's a really wonderful fantasy world that has some very non-typical sorts of things going on in it, compared to what I think of like classic fantasy of like Tolkien and D&D. And so I found myself thinking about all the different fantasy movies that I watched as a child and teenager. And there's Legend and Willow and Labyrinth and so on. And many of them had this sort of very fantastical fairy tale feel to them, but with like a little bit of darkness underneath all of them. They were a little, there was a little bit of dark stuff going on.
Like much more than a little bit of darkness.
In Never-Ending Story, people lose hope. Like, Rockbiter is just distraught, and that's where the name of the game comes from, is when Rockbiter, the giant stone man, says they look like good strong hands, don't they? Labyrinth is about the kidnapping of a baby.
That's why I said
as wonderful as it is to have all these lovely Muppet characters, and David Bowie is a hoot in that role. Yeah, it's about kidnapping a baby. And Legend gets very dark with the antagonist is named Darkness, and it's essentially the devil. And he's a bad guy. And he does all he can to corrupt the maiden character Lily. And so I found myself kind of like, well, hey, there's an idea for a fantasy game that's not just doing what D&D and Tolkien type stuff does. I wonder if I can make a game that does that. And so that's where it kind of started.
Well, what you just actually said was partly an answer to my next question, because all the movies you mentioned, those 80s gems like The Labyrinth, The Willow, and of course Never-Ending Story, and Dark Crystal too. Yeah, those are also the movies of my childhood, and that's why it so quickly touched my heart when I read Good Strong Hands, and I felt like I was just back in time. So can you remember which of those titles have you watched the most times? Because I know for me it was definitely The Labyrinth. I've watched it like every summer, every summer.
Oh boy. I think back in the day, I probably watched Willow more than anything. Just because I think it was one of those movies that like I was able to get on VHS tape easily, because it was a bigger budget thing. It was a Ron Howard movie. It had some stars that they were kind of like relatively new at the time, but we recognize them as being pretty big stars today with Val Kilmer. But overall, I don't think there's one of those that I've necessarily watched a lot more than the others. I've watched them all quite a bit. If I'm in the right mood, and they are different moods that I get into that will make me want to watch this one or that one. If I want to see a really cool evil guy, Legend is the way to go, because Darkness as a character is so intriguing and fun to watch. If I want pure, fantastical, oh my goodness, this feels like, Never-Ending Story is good for that, because it's all, very much built around Bastian and his like reading the book and imagining himself, in the world. And if I want Muppet fun, then it's all Labyrinth, because there's so much fun with all the goblins and all the different creatures that she runs into in the Labyrinth.
So were you, coming back to Never-Ending Story, were you one of those kids who cried when Artax was drowning in Neverending Story, because like everybody I know, including myself, that was a trauma of my childhood. That this moment in this movie, were you one of those kids?
I don't know that I cried, but I know it affected me. And the reason I know it affected me is if you look at the cover of Good Strong Hands, it features two characters pulling their friend out of the black muck. Now, I didn't make it a horse because that would have been a little too on the nose, but that is my homage. The cover is my homage to Artax, to if Atreyu had managed to save his best friend in the swamp.
I was hoping you're going to say that because I've paid attention to this too, but I didn't want to make any, suspicions. I wanted you to say that, but that's just exactly what I thought. So what was your favorite part of creating Good Strong Hands?
That's a tough question. I joke with people when they ask me what my favorite game is, because I get asked that quite a lot. And I joke with them, like, I love all of my games equally, just like you love all of your children equally. But Good Strong Hands is my baby. Good Strong Hands is the one that's really special to me because I feel it's an homage to those fantasy stories that got me into fantasy, which then eventually got me into science fiction and horror and all that stuff too. So it's kind of where all of this began. So it's a culmination of where I began with my love of these genres. And so I think I'm very proud of the rule set. I think the rule set for Good Strong Hands is probably, it's not the most robust game system I've developed. I think Capers is more robust, and there's more going on with Capers. But I think Good Strong Hands is, like we talked earlier about, a really tight system. It does, like, every part of it feeds the what the game is about and the themes and the experience that I want the players to have and I want the characters to have. So that's an important part of it, something that I love a great deal. I also love the idea of, if you read the book, you'll see that there's not a whole big chapter on setting. You don't go to and here's the world, and we'll describe all these towns and all these cities and all these people and all these things. Instead, what I did was I created 2-page adventure outlines, and each one gives you a little bit of information about this world, but it doesn't tell you where it is next to anything else. Like, the book actually has a blank map in it. You can draw your map. And so, because I hit on the idea of, this is a game where we're going to save the world. And every time you play it, that's what it's about, saving your world. And I felt it would be better to give enough information to get the GM and players talking about the world, and then give the players the opportunity to fill in the details. Give them just enough to get going, and then encourage them to answer questions that the GM asks, or to just volunteer ideas for what the world is about, so that when they save the world, it will mean more because they helped create it and they're already invested in it. I think that's one of the parts of the game that it sings really, really nicely.
Yes, I think this is absolutely great. How open the world is, how many things are in the hands of the players. And in Good Strong Hands, based on starter, you've got like 4 main characters to choose from. You've got Brownie, human, pixie, Stonkin, and human. So those are 5, sorry. And now the question to you would be, which one are you the most in your heart?
Oh boy.
Or you can give me percentage, like I'm 90% human, 10% brownie, this type of stuff.
I think maybe I'm 50-50 human and stonekin. The thing that I love, the thing that I love the most about stonekin is they're these big rock creatures. They look strong and tough and formidable. And one of the few things that's actually described about them, because again, I don't get into a lot of detail. I let the players kind of decide more about what the Stonekin are like. But one of the things that the Stonekin are described as is that they feel emotions very deeply. They feel it at the center of their core. And the Stonekin is a rock person, and so they're kind of a little bit of an homage to Rockbiter. But they're also the way they are can be so gentle and be so emotional is an homage to and now I'm blanking on his name. Smell bad from Labyrinth. What's his name? The big furry guy.
I
He's so
forgot the name too,
sensitive.
but we know
Yeah.
who are we talking about?
The big,
Definitely.
the big full size furry
Yeah.
guy who talks about how it smelled bad. And he's so soft and lovable, and you know that he's just got a big old warm heart underneath there.
Yeah.
And so I kind of mashed those two character ideas together, and that's how the Stonekin came about.
50-50. Okay, so now it's gonna be a tough choice. Imagine for any reason you need to completely delete one of those characters and ban them from Reverie. Which one would that be?
Yikes. Well, oh boy, that's hard because they all
I
play
know.
a nice little role. I got to look at the list to make sure I don't forget anybody. Here's my list. Okay.
Yeah, this one is pretty hard.
I would say maybe sylphs. Maybe
Okay.
sylphs wouldn't necessarily need to be there. We have another little flying creature. Sylphs have their own flavor. They're different from pixies. Maybe sylphs, or maybe either imps or redcaps, because they're the two that are kind of like the mischievous, kind of like slightly more cantankerous and a little darker. You don't necessarily need both of them, but that's tough.
Yeah,
Because
definitely.
there's some that just are very different. Like animants are like magical items. They're like intelligent physical items, like a singing sword or a suit of armor that walks around on its own, or a candelabra from Beauty and the Beast. And so they're weird. And they don't have to be there, but they're so different.
Still,
It makes them very unique.
exactly, that's what I was about to say, that each of them are unique. Let's talk a little bit about Reverie, this main imaginary world that our players create. And actually, when I was running this game lately, I gave this little task for my players. Each of them was a different kind, and I asked each of them to plan one specific celebration, a festival that is typical for their part of the world. So, Pixies had their festival.
Lovely.
Stonekins had their festival. So, what would be your festival for your Reverie? Which would be one festival? Yes, your personal Reverie. What would be the festival that would be absolutely necessary and obligatory in your Reverie?
Okay, well, if I were a human who got pulled into Reverie, because that's where all humans come from, they all come in the game, humans all come from outside Reverie. It's like Labyrinth, where you get pulled in. So if I were a human who got pulled into Reverie and I got to establish a festival, I would want it to be a storytelling festival where people came to exchange stories once a year to tell the stories of the most wonderful or the most heartbreaking or the most exciting things that they've encountered over the past year, and for there to be master scribes there to record those stories for posterity. Because if role-playing games are about telling stories. Having those stories preserved in some way is a good thing. And with Good Strong Hands, it's very much intended to be a sort of fairy tale, sort of storybook type of setting. So I definitely want there to be a record of the stories.
I think it would be an awesome festival. So, as a closure, I've got one more question. If you had to encourage someone who has never played RPG before to play Good Strong Hands with only one sentence, what would be that sentence?
Ooh, that's putting me on the spot. One sentence.
Let's make it, it can be up to 3. Let's make it easier.
Okay.
Okay.
The world is all yours. Make it what you want it to be, but make sure it survives.
Well, if I heard something like that, I would definitely like to play. And I had a pleasure not playing, but running the game. So thank you so much again for having this lovely chat and giving us lots of information, lots of ideas, and lots of inspiration and hype for playing Good Strong Hands. And hopefully, this is only, the beginning, because we want to spread the word. This game is not widely known in our fandom, but I hope it will, because it's worthy. So thank you so much for your presence and for this interview. And for all of you who are watching or listening, go read and play Good Strong Hands, because it's 100% worth it. Just have a look at it, because you will never forget the first time you read it and play it. Thank you so much, Craig.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for being so kind. And, it can be tough toiling in the quiet by myself, working on these games. But when somebody tells you that your game has touched them in some way, it makes it worth it. It makes it really, really special. So thank you.
We definitely did. I actually wanted to ask you, it might be on record, it might be off, but we will see. But I wanted to ask you, can you remember the first time you actually found out what is RPG, and what was the first system you've ever played? Because I've been really curious about that.
Oh, sure. I know that. I can't tell you a lot of detail about it because it was a long time ago, but it was near the end of my first year in college. I never got into games in high school, although I came close. I had friends who played D&D, and I just never played. But in college, right toward the end of the first year, my friend Brian suggested that we play Dungeons and Dragons. He thought I would like the game, so he ran a game, the second edition D&D, set in Ravenloft, which is the horror setting, the gothic horror setting. And because he knew I was a horror movie fan, so he figured that'll rope me in. And I played a half-elf half-elf bard, and I almost got eaten by a giant frog in the swamp. There was giant. We were first level characters. Giant frogs were scary to first level characters. I only had 6 hit points, and I almost lost my character in the first game.
Oh, that would be so discouraging. I mean, how could you then possibly be in favor of, okay, I want to play more, when you think, I just had one session and my character died? It's just like so depressing. But it's great that it didn't happen and that you moved on with the subject, because you've created so much in the world of RPGs. And for those of you who haven't visited, remember that Nerdburger Games, visit the page, look at the games they have, because really they have a wide choice of small and very cozy and inspirational games, and also even solo games, right? Because you've got those too. So everybody can find something for themselves. Thanks again, Craig. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. I had a great time.
Thank you so much.